Great, let's just wait for the last people to come in. Great, I think we're ready. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Enrique Crespo, and I will be your moderator and I would say host for this first meeting and the upcoming ones as well. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the AI for Cities 2.0, the Caribbean Forum, an initiative that is designed to explore the role of artificial intelligence in accelerating sustainable development and resilience in the Caribbean. This forum is made possible through the collaborative effort and leadership of the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, supported by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in partnership with the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Trinidad and Tobago, MDT, the Association of Caribbean States, ACS, the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, CAF, and the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. So as you can tell, we are a lot of institutions that are working in the realm of AI, trying to foster our best efforts to drive resilience and innovation in the Caribbean. All together with all of you, thank you for being here. Why are we here? As a small island developing states, our region faces unique challenges, limited capacity, small institutions, constrained resources, and heightened vulnerabilities due to climate change and economic shocks. Yet AI offers a transformative opportunity to improve public sector operations, enhance citizen services, and drive inclusive and sustainable growth. Recognizing this potential, we are convening these meetings to discuss a series of matters regarding AI. So we'll be showing you in today's session the AI basics for public institutions, laying the foundations for AI understanding. And to do that, we have two amazing speakers that are joining us today. So without further ado, let me first introduce Professor David Eves. Professor David Eves is Co-Deputy Director and Associate Professor in Digital Government at UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, IIPP. David teaches and writes on digital era public administration, digital transformation, and the governance of digital public infrastructure. David co-founded Teaching Public Service in Digital Age, which brings together faculty from around the world to co-design and share an open license curriculum on how to teach the minimum needed digital competences for future public leaders. These materials are used by hundreds of faculty members in over 60 universities across 30 countries. His work on digital public infrastructure, including establishing the Digital Public Infrastructure Map, is used by researchers, donors, investment banks, and countries around the world. David's expertises are sought out by numerous governments. He's taught or advised senior officials in the government of Brazil, South Africa, Singapore, India, the United States, and Canada, amongst others. In 2024, he was appointed by the United Kingdom Ministry of the Department for Science, Innovation, and Technology to a 12-person expert advisory committee chaired by Baroness Fox and CDDO Chair Paul Wilmot to help advise on a 10-year digital strategy for the UK government. David is also proud of his work as a negotiator advisor to numerous tech organizations, government, and environmental groups. He served as a negotiation advisor to a coalition of Canadian environmental government organizations during 2 years of negotiations with the Forest Product Association of Canada, which helped cement the groundbreaking Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement. So with quite a CV and quite an influence on the digital realm for public servants, let's give a kind welcome to Professor David Eves. Professor Eves, the floor is yours.
Enrique, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to talk both about artificial intelligence, and then also, I think one of the reasons I was asked to talk is I've written a paper recently with a colleague of mine, Sarosh, on the interaction between digital public infrastructure and artificial intelligence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those as we kind of move towards what it means on the AI side. So maybe for my talk, there's kind of three things I want to just talk about. One is I really want to set context about why AI and DPI I think are so interesting to governments at the moment. I want to talk about how governments are responding to broader challenges of kind of governing in a digital era, and then what this means and how to be thinking about where AI and digital public infrastructure fit into those challenges and into that work. So first, just the challenge. So maybe some of you have seen this before, but like, at a high level, according to Gartner, there's about $700 billion spent on technology by government and education institutions around the world. Of that 700 billion, almost 600 billion is spent in broadly the global north. So North America, Western Europe, China, mature Asia, Japan, which only leaves about 80 billion that's being spent by the rest of the planet. It's like it's pretty astounding. And so these circles are done to ratio, and it really gives you a sense of the disparity in spend. What makes this all the more striking is that I don't think you look at the way these governments are working digitally and you say most of them are really a model that you would want to pursue. Like, I don't think anybody, I'm Canadian, nobody is looking at the Canadian government and saying, that's the digital government I would like to have in my country. And I don't think anyone's looking at the German government or the French government and saying, yes, that's what we want to replicate. So we have this incredible amount of spend, but I'm not sure it's generating the type of value that we'd like. Yeah, so I think Estonia, just in the comments here, I'm going to play right off of the comments. The Estonia is a great example, but what's worth noting about Estonia is that when they started their journey, their per capita GDP was like $2,200 US a year. So the Estonians made choices because they were poor, not because they actually fit the kind of OECD kind of norm of kind of like what a country is. They were in fact quite the opposite. So if you broke that spend down on a per capita basis, basically these countries are spending about $250 per person. These countries over here are spending $14 per person. And I think one thing that's interesting, and there's a whole bunch of countries in this circle here that are actually doing quite well and doing very innovative and interesting things and serving their populations quite well. And that led me personally, as someone who's been studying transformation, to kind of want to take a closer look at who are the leaders in this bucket, because they're doing more with less. And what should we learn from them? And what should we be trying to replicate? All the more reason, because if we did want to take these countries over here and like level set their spending at $250 per head, we'd have to go find $1.4 trillion every year in perpetuity, which we're not going to find, not in the middle of a climate crisis, in the middle of like fiscal constraints from the last pandemic. It's just that money's not going to exist. So, and just to really put that into context, the 1.4 trillion, that's the equivalent of the pre-demolition of USAID. That's the equivalent of sevenfold the OECD's foreign aid budget. So you have to take the OECD country's foreign aid budget, multiply by 7 every year in perpetuity to fund digital government in the same way that these people are paying for it. I think the Caribbean faces, as was noted by our hosts, some specific challenges on top of this. So like everybody, you have climate change challenges, although I think they're in some ways unique given additional storm activity and rising sea levels for yourselves. You have fiscal crunches coming out of like the previous fiscal crises, low population based so that impacts your ability to be efficient and amortize costs across taxpayer bases. And then of course, you also have ambitions in many places to end poverty. And who knows, we may have another kind of like global shock coming our way at some point, such as a pandemic. So all of us are going to have to be able to do more with the resources we have and possibly less. So how have governments responded to this digitally? Well, I think when you look at a lot of the way governments are structured, and you'll probably see your own government in this model, I have this simple model of governments, which is like there's ministries or departments. They want to run applications. It's like they want to get people to sign up for passports or driver's license, get them a health benefit. There's some application, which is the process you want to run, whether on paper or online. And then there's a database that remembers the history of those transactions. Did I get approved for a driver's license? What is my driver's license number? When does it expire? You're keeping all of those records on hand so you can make sure that I'm not doing anything wrong, or when I come back to renew that you know it's me. The challenge that we have is that when you look at most governments, when they're offering those services, they're running those applications, they're recreating things over and over and over again. Every one of these services has a way of signing into it. Every single one of them wants to know what your address is. You have to enter an address and validate it against some address database. They want a unique identifier from you. They all have these different forms they want you to fill out. There's all of this duplicative activity that's getting recreated across all of these ministries. And then, of course, they're storing all of that data, that duplicative data themselves. So every single ministry has its own Oracle servers. It's paying Oracle licensing fees, or Amazon or Microsoft or whoever, paying them licensing fees to store the exact same data that the ministry next door is also storing. So this incredible amount of duplication. Also, like very few standards. And all of this makes it harder for you to run an AI system, because now your AI has to learn different ways that different ministries work. It has to figure out if David Eves is the same David Eves here as they are there. Everything becomes harder for the humans to do. It's also harder for the AIs to do. Now, we like this model because we have clear governance around it. We have ministers who are in charge. We have budgets that are assigned by the finance department that are vertically allocated. So we want this ministry to do something, we give them money, and we hold the minister, and then, of course, the principal secretary and everybody down accountable. So a very nice, clean accountability model that we understand that adheres to a world of paper. Like, we knew how to hold people accountable when these were pieces of paper shuffling around, and we've just been like, okay, we're not going to do paper, we're going to do computers, but we're going to keep all the computers siloed by ministries. And in fact, the problem's worse than this, because if you go into one of these departments, it's not like that department does a single activity. The tax department does many things. And each one of the things has its own computer system, running its own applications, do its own things, collecting its own data, and hosting all of the exact same data the other system next door is also hosting, but on its own servers and its own storage. Okay. So what we need to be start thinking about is like, how do we make government more interoperable? Because if we want the humans to be more efficient and effective, and we want to solve new problems, and we want AI to be effective, we've got to figure out a way to solve interoperability. And so, the kind of metaphor I think about this is two things you're trying to solve for. One is you want more things to talk to each other, but you want them to be able to talk to each other without slowing each other down. You want them to be able to talk to each other, but still continue to evolve in a way that serves their interests. So you want a system that can have high variability components and low variability components that are kind of evolving at different speeds. And so what does that look like? Well, your smartphone looks like that, right? So your smartphone, say you have an iPhone, it has an operating system. Your high variability components are the apps that you download. Those apps are getting updated weekly. Most apps get updated weekly now. You're downloading them, you're discarding them, you're deleting them. Like there's constant change going on up here. But what's so amazing about these applications is that they always work with the hardware on your phone. And that hardware is getting updated every time you update your phone. So every 2 years, 3, 4 years, you get a new smartphone. All the hardware is new accelerometer, new camera, new processor. And yet your applications immediately work with this new hardware. And the reason they do is because there's this infrastructure layer of software that basically says, oh, if you want to access the camera, you kind of query this API and it will work with whatever camera's on your phone, whether it's a new phone or an old phone. So that's why when you buy a new phone and you enter in your username and password into your account and then downloads all your apps, everything works magically. It's because you have this infrastructure layer that all of the applications are connecting with, and then it handles how to deal with with the hardware. And that model allows for you to have high variability, things that evolve very quickly and things that evolve relatively slowly. So these are evolving every week. These are evolving once a year. You get a new phone every year, like a new phone type every year, new applications coming out weekly, updates weekly, all because you have this stable interface that allows them to work together. And that's when I observe kind of governments around the world that are doing interesting things, they're trying to replicate this model to enable interoperability, but allow different parts of government to evolve at different speeds. And so, what they're doing, what this kind of infrastructure view of government looks like, is not so much positioning everything in terms of silos, but starting to think about infrastructure. So, here you have your services, you have some data that, the data that, kind of evolves slowly that you're collecting, services, and then some shared components that allow these things to work well together. And so at the bottom, like your data, those are like your canonical registries. Like government's really just a series of registries. And this is what your AI systems really want to be able to access. So how do we have single sources of truth about various things that are happening across government? And then your services layer, that's like all of the things you want to be really dynamic. Some of these things you're always offering, like passports, but the way you offer them might change. New government, new policies, new international rules means you have to adapt them very, very, very quickly. A crisis emerges, you want to be able to offer a new service, a new benefit. Maybe you need to train people online because of the pandemic. So how do you spin up something really, really quickly? And that's all made more easy if you have some core infrastructure that's shared across your government or even across all of society. And at a minimum, that would be something like an authentication system. So people can authenticate themselves online into services. And that's what India has done, and Estonia has done, and the Singaporeans have done. You have a single sign-on with a digital identity that lets you authenticate into services. And then you want some way of receiving or sending money, and that's what the Brazilians have done with Pix, and the Indians have done with UPI. And then you want some sort of data exchange, some way to move data, at least across government, but maybe even across different actors in society. And that's what the Estonians have done with X-Road, and the Indians have started to do with DigiLocker. So here you you zoom in on like Estonia, which is like maybe the best known of these. This is kind of what the Estonian model looks like. You have all of these are the registries. These are the registries of data that you'd want to have. And then the X road is this data exchange system that allows people to move data around by using their unique ID, their EID, their digital identity to identify who they are and to go and collect data on their behalf. Now, I think it's very easy to think about this as like a technology solution. But the real way I like to think of X road and what the Estonians have done is every single government has to share data between ministries. And right now, every single time you share data between ministries, you have to get lawyers in the room and you have to sign a memorandum of understanding. And what I think what we want to be doing is what the Estonians did that was so clever is they said, we're going to get rid of all of these bespoke and unique memorandums of understanding, of which initially there were hundreds and there were thousands. In many governments, most people don't even know how many of these exist, but they're often in the thousands and even the tens of thousands of memorandums of understanding on how we're going to share data, have to be negotiated and renewed and managed. And the Estonians just said, no, 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 no. We're going to create a single standardized MOU for sharing data, and we're going to codify that in our data exchange system. So now, anytime anybody wants to share data, they don't have to go negotiate anything. There is a default way of doing it that's protected. It has privacy rules behind it, cybersecurity rules behind it. No more arguing about what you can use the data for. All this stuff. There's a single standard MOU. That's the real genius of what the Estonians did. Now, it doesn't have to end with data exchange and identity and payments. You could begin to think about like what are all of the core systems you'd need to run a modern day government. And then you could start to ask yourself, could you create open source versions of those so that you weren't beholden to vendors for managing them? And again, all of these solutions here that I've listed on this page are broadly open source or managed by the governments themselves to avoid vendor lock-in. And on the next page, when I showed you these other types of systems, like those our governments are creating and open sourcing as well. And so things like Digit, which India has created, Notify by the UK government, all of these are available online. So governments are starting to share this kind of core infrastructure. And that includes AI systems, which I'm going to come to, which are starting to be shared to solve certain types of problems, like particularly around translation. So this is a world of kind of like, of public digital infrastructure, but you could imagine this all being private. Like you could imagine a world where all of these systems are actually managed by private entities, and you're kind of beholden to them. And I'm really interested in what it looks like for it to be public. There are a lot of experiments with this around the world. So the DPI map, which I linked to earlier in the chat, we've been kind of basically trying to identify all of these that we can find around the world. And we found several hundred of them. What's I think particularly interesting is there are many examples of this that already exist in the Caribbean. So you have at least 11 digital ID projects and 11 payment systems that are publicly managed in the Caribbean and 3 active data exchange systems that we could find already. And this is not even counting like Trinidad and Tobago is about to launch a credentials project. So lots of action going on. Okay. If that's the underlying infrastructure, the reason I wanted to talk all about that is that it's much easier to do AI if you get the underlying infrastructure right. And so if I think about kind of like what is the publicness or what is the stack upon which your society, like your island nation is running, well, at the bottom of that stack is your power, right? Like without power, there's nothing. You're not doing anything on computers. You're not doing anything on the internet. You need to have power. So you have your power in your grid. And then stacked on top of that is like the internet. And then there's like some functions of storage and compute, whether those are being run by you or run by a cloud provider, but you have to have storage and compute somewhere that's kind of powering these systems. And then stacked on top of that is like your digital public infrastructure. So your identity layer, your payments layer, your data exchange. And then there's the data you're collecting, the devices people are using, and the applications on those devices. So this is what your delivery stack looks like for running a modern state. And I think the question you want to ask yourself is what elements of this should be public and what can be private? And how do we want to manage that? And many of these, even if there's private actors running them, they're regulated in such a way that they are at least a public interest engaged in managing them. And we have a whole paper on what is public and digital public infrastructure that kind of dives deeper into this. But for me, I think the bigger question too is like, what's going to be the answer around AI? Like, is AI going to be an entirely private solution that only citizens are going to use AI on you as a government? Or are you going to be running AI as internally government? And if so, how are you going to allow those to be trusted and secure? And I think what makes this all the more difficult at the moment is where is AI even going to fit in this stack? And I think even here we don't know. Like a few weeks ago, prior to the DeepSeek, everybody assumed that actually AI was going to be so expensive to run that it was actually going to sit at the compute layer, and there'd be very, very few operators who were going to be basically managing the service on many people's behalf, because it was going to have to be centralized. But then DeepSeek suddenly made it appear maybe it's a whole lot cheaper to do, and so actually maybe AI is going to be embedded in everything. And those two models are going to reveal very, very different ways of doing things. And so the part I kind of want you to start thinking about is how, if you're going to be using AI, you're going to be in a much better position if your data governance and your internal data inside government is much better organized. And then you can be strategic about where you want to go use it. So some of the great examples I've seen so far is like here in Singapore, I mentioned SingPass, their identity system. Well, now they're using AI to try to identify like when are people logging on in fraudulent ways? When are people actually having their ID stolen? Can they use AI to kind of identify outlier instances so they can then protect people and help them, like reach out to them and like, hey, we think your identity's been stolen. You know, can we help you make sure that this is not the case? Or if it is, how do we do some remediation very quickly? Or up in India, they're using AI to like the big companies aren't doing translation into like 30 languages that are common in India. So they're creating a translation layer that they're stacking on top of their digital public infrastructure to make it understandable verbally and written to a huge numbers of people, like hundreds of millions of people in their country that don't currently speak English and have languages that aren't really easy to translate into. I think the other thing is we're starting to also explore like how AI could improve. Like if you want to have really high quality AI, you're going to have a good training data sets to use it with. Well, that means you have to organize your data, which means you're going to want a data exchange to have canonical sources of truth about information about your citizen. Otherwise, your AI is going to be learning that I have 5 different languages, depending on when I last used a service from different government agencies, or it's going to have all this conflicting data about me. So the more we can begin to harness and manage the infrastructure of our data, the smarter and more intelligent our AI is going to be. So I think there's like really nice interactions with these, but I think what I'm worried about is people are going to kind of plow ahead and just be like, oh, we're gonna start using AI for everything, without actually realizing that's the icing on top of a much bigger cake that you need to be getting right. And you can't just come start layering icing on top of everything. If it's not, if the cake is not baked right, it's going to collapse. It's going to taste gross. It's not going to work well. Work with me on the metaphor, but you got to really begin to think about it. Okay. There are going to be real challenges as well in the kind of AI space. Like I think I'm nervous about over indexing on AI at the moment because I think the cost structure for it is unclear for us. Like, are the best AI models going to be ones that are distributed or ones that are centralized? I want to really make sure that we're thinking about interoperability. And then I think most importantly, though, is really getting the governance right. And I have some additional kind of information I can share with you because I don't want to run long. But for me, the core thing here is, what are we doing to maximize citizens' trust in government, both from an infrastructure perspective and from an AI perspective? Because if we get that wrong, the hole that we dig ourselves is so hard to dig out of. And a key piece of that is really figuring out how we're going to get remediation right. So when something goes wrong, there's clear, easy paths for someone to go and fix that problem. Because if you don't give those clear, easy paths, people are not going to trust these systems, and then they're not going to trust you. Okay, let me stop there. I don't want to go too long, but we'll come back with some Q&A, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Reeves. Love the metaphor about the icing on the cake, because most of the times when we're discussing AI precisely, it seems that we need to go way back to have a further conversation on how digital is being embedded. So DPI has become a quite, with a unique and interesting perspective for governments around the world to embrace this digital transformation and the opportunities it brings. Without further ado, we wanted to have this meeting be as interactive as possible, given that is on a virtual manner. So I would ask my colleagues to please share the screen with us. We have a Mentimeter prepared for all the participants here. So now you have the link in the chat. If you want to click on it, all the participants that are here with us, you will have a question on your screen that says, when you think about AI in public institutions, what's the first word that comes to mind? Let me share my screen so maybe I can show the Menti that you should be seeing right now. Is everybody seeing my screen? I hope so. With the Mentimeter. Okay, so if everybody on the chat is seeing this form right now on the Mentimeter, please use the words that come to mind. When you think about AI in public institutions, what the first word that comes to mind? We're going to give you 1 or 2 minutes just to fill out this Mentimeter. Click on the word summit, and then we'll be checking on the answers and sharing on the screen as well. Dear Karen, if you can share your screen, because I think if you share it, we can see the answers on real time. Thank you so much. Perfect. So we're seeing there's some responses already. Efficiency is low, user centricity, data security, need for good governance, opportunities, privacy, trusts, productivity. Wow, a lot of reflections here. So I'm not going to keep on reading, as you can see it on the screen by yourselves. But we also be logging into all these answers because this meeting will be transcribed in a private way so that we can have a knowledge product that synthesizes the conversations that we're going to have here. So we're going to wait, I think, only a couple of seconds more. We already have over 8 responses, so quite an engaged audience. Loving that so far. Wow, so efficiency is a must. A lot of people here are thinking about efficiency, productivity, security, trust comes as well, progress, privacy, transparency, automation, accountability, no buy-in from staff. That's a quite interesting one. Data clash delay. So I think, David, you already inspired a lot of our participants coming with the reflections that are coming on for AI and what people are thinking right now in this forum about AI at public institutions. Dear Karen, if we can go to the next question, please. These questions that will come are part of what Professor Eve shared with us. So how confident are you that the AI revolution will make your government better? So I would say that the majority right now is thinking very optimistically about it. So we have that at least 63% of the participants right now in the forum. If you keep on voting through the Mentimeter, we can see the results being updated on real time. So I think most of the people in the forum are feeling from optimistic to very optimistic, while a minority is not feeling as optimistic as the rest. So Professor Eves, for your reflections on this question, maybe we can have the next one as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel mixed myself. I think one of the things that is clear is it takes a while for a technology to shake out to be kind of like understood what it's going to mean. And I think there's, for me, like the real risk is you move too quickly and you break trust, and then it becomes hard for people to, it's hard to recover from. But I feel so much empathy for government. The inverse is also true. If you don't move fast enough and you fall too far behind what the private sector is doing, then people also lose trust. They go, oh, the government's inefficient, it's not effective, why is my experience here worse? And so I always find like what I want from my government are to be really fast followers. I don't need my governments to de-risk AI technologies. I don't need you to be on the cutting edge. I don't need you to be doing the very first thing. But what I'd like you to be doing is observing and seeing what is working and being a very fast follower. Because if a company uses AI in a way that turns out to be risky or problematic, and the public turns against them, and let's say they go bankrupt, that's sad. It's sad for people who lose their jobs, but it's not existential for society. But if people lose confidence and faith in their government, then a core tool that we have for addressing social problems falls away and becomes much harder to use. So I want you to kind of to be an adopter, but I want you to be observing what's going out there. And I'm not worried about being first movers, but I just don't want you to take 30, 40 years to capitalize on the benefits.
Thank you for that reflection, Professor Eves. And regarding this, we're going to go through both of the Mentimeters that Professor Eves has shared with us, and then I'll give the floor to people that want to make some questions to Professor Eves directly before we move with our second panelist, Ms. Erica Simmons. So in one word, in which area of government do you think AI has the biggest potential for impact that we're seeing here from the cloud of words? That education, health and services, and social services, which could be widely connected, so to social protection and services as well, are key from what the audience is feeling about the potential of AI. Professor Eves, in your experience, what have you seen that you can relate to these answers? Education, services. I've seen a lot of social protection, to be honest, a lot of course, data that needs to be managed. So AI could play a big chunk on that in developing countries such as the ones in Latin America and the Caribbean. So just a quick reflection from what you're seeing that the audience is seeing as the broad opportunities for AI to shape governance in the region.
I think at this stage, I'm going to err on the side of caution. And I'm going to say, so one is, I'm not sure I'm seeing a lot of use cases inside government of AI systems that are kind of like a period. Like some governments are running trials, but it's not like people are running AI systems at scale right now that are solving huge numbers of problems. Like the examples I listed in my presentation are examples we had to go actively find. Like it's not an overwhelming amount that's happening in production at scale. And the reason I share all this is like, I would be cautious about taking something full scale to market in a government today, because again, the risks are unknown unless you have incredible remediation and you know how to identify when something has failed and you know how to solve it. um, I'm not really confident that I want to be unleashing this like on the public, right now. What I would be saying I want to be doing is I want to use it in qualified ways. So I think one area where AI has proven to be interesting is, say, in identifying outliers. So in like the combating of fraud, even there AI isn't used as a tool to just simply find it. It helps burn down the haystack and allow your human resources to focus on a smaller set of kind of like suspect transactions as opposed to having to search the entire haystack. And like, but there's still a human in the loop, which I think is appropriate at this stage. What I'd love to see is us doing the inverse, which is like, can we be using AI to identify all the people who should be getting a benefit who are not currently getting a benefit? So we can burn down the haystack, find like vulnerable people who need help, but then have humans do the last mile of reaching out and connecting to them. Maybe at some point in the future we can automate it all, but I'd want to start being a little more cautious.
Thank you for that reflection, Professor Reeves, because I think it brings up that there is also a need for, I would say, what philosophical or principle discussion about AI, because what you're saying is not necessarily AI used for efficiency in the sense that some people are thinking, okay, let's use AI to just trim down costs as if the government is a private company, but let's make services better. And that resonates a lot with all the organizations that organize this forum, because we're thinking, let's leave no one behind. So how can AI close gaps instead of widen those gaps? And I love that reflection that you're giving us. To our audience, we have a Q&A open at the chatting Zoom. So if you want to ask some questions, you can do so now. I'm going to read these questions from one of our participants, Mr. Paul Hector, saying, in your work, what do you see as best practices in building the capacity of citizens, public servants, and society as a whole to engage and adopt these systems? What can the Caribbean learn? That is a question for you, Professor Reeves.
Yeah, so so two things I'd be a really big fan of. So the first is really engaging in broad public consultations that are kind of like educative in their form. I mean, when I look at the adoption of any technology in government, one of the key mistakes governments often make is they get caught up in the efficiency possibilities and they don't go out and ask like who's impacted, who's positively impacted, who's negatively impacted, who's being left behind, and like do the hard work of outreach to figure out what are their vulnerable communities and then engage them, understand what their concerns are. And it doesn't mean you have to mitigate every possible concern, but you have to have at least a framework and a strategy for how you're going to bring everybody along on this journey. And the big mistake, technology after technology, I see governments to go, they kind of see an opportunity and they just drive for it and they don't go talk to anybody. So the first, I'd say I'd want to go talk to people. The second is um, I really do think that using breeds understanding. So I'm also quite nervous about us saying, like, I'm quite cautious about us using AI in production. Like, well, by production, I mean actually using it like directly on services, unsupervised. But I am very keen to enable public servants to play with it, in part because in playing with it, you will learn about its limitations. Like this technology is not perfect, it's not magical. And by learning its limitations, you may become both, I think, a healthy enthusiast, but also a healthy skeptic simultaneously.
Thank you so much for that reflection, Professor Reeves. I'm going to take two more questions before we move to Ms. Simon's presentation. And the rest of them, if you leave them at the Q&A or at the chat, we'll be recollecting them. And hopefully, Professor Reeves will have some time to share some thoughts after the meeting about them. So the next question, and I think I'm going to combine the two of them together, is how do we manage, and this builds on your reflection, Professor Reeves, to reach vulnerable people who are currently out of these governmental data sets, whatever form or shape they have? And then the follow-up questions is, or those people that are not tech savvy or literate, because there is, of course, an issue again of not AI necessarily so, but a digital divide in Latin America and the Caribbean. So some part of the population is already, of course, well connected. Some others are not. So how can we build on DPI? Because I know, again, this is about strengthen the government and the services and the quality of the delivery of services that we have. So giving you the floor to give us some thoughts on that, Professor Reeves. Sorry, you're muted, Professor Reeves, sorry.
Thank you. So this is a fantastic question. And I'm always, so there's several things. One is I'm always very keen on never launching services population scale right off the bat. And so I'm always teaching my students about taking an iterative approach and actually working with, initial communities to launch a service within a community so you can understand its impacts. And as you begin to understand both the benefits and the drawbacks, who's being included, who's being excluded, because sometimes you have ideas about who's going to be included and you have ideas about who's going to be excluded, and you're just wrong. You kind of slowly ramp up kind of who you're involving and who you're offering the service to, so you're learning and growing as you go, and you don't go immediately population scale with a set of assumptions that might be wrong. I think the other thing I think that's kind of exciting about the possibilities of AI, and this is certainly where the Indian government sees it this way, is they really see it as a way of overcoming tech illiteracy, or even actually just more basic like illiteracy. And so they're really focused on how do you get translation into all of the languages that are spoken in India so you can get services out to everybody digitally. But then more importantly, how can you do that in ways that are kind of verbal? So, there's like 300 to 400 million Indians cannot read or write. So if you can start to create, kind of chat bots that can actually verbally communicate with people and answer their questions in a really intelligent way in their native languages, you could potentially really close some of the inclusion gaps. So I think that's exciting, but then you want to figure out, okay, who does that not work for? And how are we always making sure we have a fallback for those who are being left behind, where there's still a way for them to go in and kind of interface with their government with a human, because I think that fallback is always going to be necessary.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Isban. One last question before we turn to Ms. Simmons, and I think it has to do more, and I think in terms of DPI, because the question is quite interesting. Noting that the Caribbean is, of course, prone to be affected by climate change disasters, whether that might be a hurricane or another example, of course. What happens when the energy is not there? I know it seems like a kind of a tricky question, because we're preparing to have a lay stack of digital government. Digital needs electricity. So how do you kind of prepare to embrace this digital transformation while considering the particularities of a vulnerable section of the Caribbean that is, of course, exposed to climate change hazards?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a wonderful question. I mean, it's not just a question for AI or DPI. I mean, that's a question for all things digital, period. And again, I think you want, when I showed you that stack, that your service delivery is built on top of, you want to be thinking about what is the resilience. Often people think in terms of cybersecurity, but what is the resilience of every layer of that stack? And that includes the very bottom layer, which is the energy. And I think the more distributed your energy system, the more localized, the kind of probably the better off you're going to be. And I think one of the things that's so exciting is the declining prices of solar and storage mean that those opportunities have never been greater for you to kind of have resilience in that system. I would also just say on the AI side, like the possibility that models might be cheaper to train and cheaper to operate, and therefore might take a lot less energy, is also very exciting development for smaller countries.
Thank you so much, Professor Reeves. And to our audience that is, of course, asking for more time to answer a couple of more questions that are in the Q&A, we'll do that by the end. We still have another space for Q&A after Ms. Simmons' presentation, so don't worry about that. We'll make the best out of it so we can get both of our speakers to answer some of those questions. So keep dropping them in the Q&A as well. We'll do that exercise by the end as well. So now moving on to the second part of our conversation. Now let me introduce our second speaker of today, Ms. Erica Simmons. Ms. Erica Simmons is a sought-after public speaker on innovation, digital transformation, artificial intelligence, STEM and technology, and the future of work. She has gained much of her experience during a successful 25-year professional career in the enterprise software technology industry. A Jamaican by birth, sorry for that, she is considered an expert on the challenges and opportunities of integrating artificial intelligence in the Caribbean region, including understanding infrastructure, cultural, governmental, and commercial challenges to integrating transformational technologies of the fourth and fifth industrial revolution. In November 2024, UNESCO published the Caribbean AI Policy Roadmap, co-authored by Ms. Simmons. This first-of-its-kind policy guidance document advocates for collective action, ethical considerations, and inclusive policymaking to harness the transformative potential of AI for the benefit of Caribbean societies. To support the adoption of key policies for the region, Ms. Simmons participates in several global technology initiatives, including being a member of the expert group implementation of UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, a member of UNESCO's AI Ethics Experts Without Borders, a member of the UNESCO Information for All program, Working Group on Information Accessibility, a member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, Planet Positive 2030 campaign, and past chairwoman of IEEE Jamaica. Ms. Simmons, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for your time and for being here with us, sharing a little bit, of course, of that wide knowledge that you have about AI. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Yes, and thank you so much, and good morning. It's my pleasure to be here with you, and I just want to thank the organizers of this conference for bringing me here and Professor Eves here to talk all about artificial intelligence. So I am a technologist for 25 years. I've worked in the large-scale enterprise software industry. So my perspective of AI is going to be a little bit more bullish. I'm going to be a little bit more on we can and we should. And hopefully I'll share with you some examples of projects currently executing today in governments around the world. And I think one of the perspectives that I want to share going into it is that AI is on a continuum. I don't think we can talk about AI as being this one thing. AI today that's being adopted in industry means a lot of things, and I'll show you some examples of AI. But I wanted to say thanks, Professor Eves. I thought that was a wonderful presentation and wonderful perspectives, and I'd like to be able to add on to that. So let me share my screen, and I have more slides than I need, but we'll go quickly through the slides if we don't need them. And my presentation today is really going to cover those real world case studies that are being implemented in governments today. Just very quickly, I wanted to talk about like, what is AI? And I just wanted to say, just very simply for the purpose of this presentation, I just want you to think about AI as being a software system that can, think of it as being a librarian that has access to a lot of information and can query this information and bring it forth to be able to assist with multiple use cases. So I just, at the very simple perspective, let's kind of go with that definition. And AI can learn from this data. It can take this data and be able to provide real world examples and reasoning and potentially problem solving. All right, so I think Professor Eves talked about this in detail, but I think that we can expect AI really to contribute to increasing citizen services and the satisfaction that our citizens have with interacting with our governments. So services, faster services overall, and really enhancing the role of government and automating that by improving really the user experience that we're going to have with government, making it easier and making government more accessible potentially and user-friendly. So these are some of the benefits that we definitely have by using AI in government. And as we talked about, that can certainly reduce costs overall if we look at replacing things like paper-based processes and minimizing errors potentially that we have today. These processes that are done by humans could potentially be done by AI and minimizing errors that we're seeing today based on those paper-based processes. And then one of the other things that we're seeing as a benefit is potentially enhancing the transparency of government services by really being able to provide things like real-time data and actionable insights to citizens. So cutting down the time that it takes government to be able to serve citizens, and actually also broadening those services for all citizens, including citizens with disabilities. And I think that Professor Eves talked about the complexity that we're seeing in government. And over to the right is really when we talk about government and talking to government from an enterprise software perspective, we are seeing a lot of this soup of mess of different platforms and services, disconnected systems. And so really, I think for the future, what you want to be thinking about is kind of having a system that would mask all of the complexity in the back, unite systems together. But I think the most important thing when we think about AI, and I think is the most important thing for us to consider, at least for the next 5 years, is that humans are still going to be involved in any AI process, really. We're looking at AI as a tool to be able to augment human capacity and human capability in delivering those government services. So I know that there's a lot of talk out there about AI putting people out of work. For the moment, the way that the large enterprise software industry is looking at AI is not replacing humans, but to maybe take away those repetitive tasks, those tasks that are cumbersome, so that humans can spend more time with citizens in explaining the delivery of services, perhaps, and not so much on the paperwork. So we're looking at breaking down a lot of the complexity that we're seeing in industry. And I just wanted to show you this platform because this is what is going in to industries today. So we have a lot of complexity down at the bottom with a lot of databases, lots of different things. But what we want to put in is a single platform that can then go across all of the departments in government and do things like case management unique to whatever function you are supporting. Be able to have citizens access information using your cell phone, using a laptop, and be able to have that self-service. So we want to put in this data model, which is going to enhance the digital experience for government. And really, it's about improving experiences of your citizens, increasing that engagement, and delivering faster services. So this is kind of the platform and the vision that I know a lot of the enterprise software companies are talking to government about. Having that one platform where all of the different departments in government can come together. And this is happening today in industry. And I have some case studies that I'll show you some specific examples of that. Okay, so what can AI do? When we think about at the very simple perspective, it's all about this data processing and taking things from paper into an automated fashion, being able to use the data to improve the decision-making and enhance the service delivery for the public benefits of citizens. So data processing and analysis is one big capability that AI can definitely bring to your governments in the Caribbean. Also taking tasks that are repetitive and maybe paper-based and putting them on technology. And what we're seeing is a lot of errors that are made with human processing of data. We can lower the error rates in that. And we can definitely look at how we're going to optimize resources because a lot of the repetitive and paper-based tasks are now automated. And potentially with all of that automation and some of the lower level things that we're doing, we can focus on more strategic initiatives that will then drive innovation in government. Natural language processing, talking to that software system and having it understand is one of the key capabilities. So when we talk about having access to government and making it more accessible for people, we can actually have systems that are going to allow people to talk to it, to give commands. Like we have chat bots right now that are being deployed in agencies all across the world that will allow citizens to ask questions of it, and it gives simple answers back. And virtual assistants are also currently being installed in government. I wanted to just give you an example of one particular municipality. This is the city of Santa Monica in California. And what they have done is they were having problems scaling their systems during COVID to meet the demand of their citizens. And it really resulted in a lack of transparency, a lack of satisfaction, duplicate requests for things. And so this particular government has a singles platform for digitized citywide processes and workflows attached to that. And that's increasing the transparency with its citizen requests. You can then go into that platform, understand the status of that request, and be able to track it all the way down to when it's been resolved. And so what the city of Santa Monica has done has put in a modern portal. It is an app-enabled self-service portal where citizens can go in and put requests in and have it be routed to the right department to be able to answer those questions. And that's for a variety of citizen services. So they have that common backbone now where all of the different departments are able to tap into and see that. So this is a real world example being implemented and being used today. And they have a net promoter score increase. This is the score of customers that are satisfied with you. So they've had a 50% increase in their NPS scores. 90% of their requests now come through that portal, and they have been able to decrease their incident response times by 50% by everybody going to this portal for citizen services and citizen requests. The city of South Dakota, that's another example here. And don't pay attention to the technology that's being used. I just want to show you the use case that's happening here. Again, another citizen-related portal that citizens can then go in to streamline their requests for vital government services. And now they have a single point of entry. They have over 9,000 people going to the portal every day. They spend 99% less time procuring competitive bids for their capital projects, and they have been able to decrease reemployment claims by 30 days. So this is also an AI implementation which features a AI chatbot that can then be accessed through the web or the phone and live chat. So this is up and going with over 13,000 people accessing that. So I wanted to just kind of talk about some of the impacts I think that AI can have on the region in the next 5 years. And so we know that AI is going to be creating thousands of new jobs and potentially creating some redundancies in the region. But I think I always want to focus on the upside. There will be people that lose jobs, but now we have to focus on reorienting those skills so that we can have people definitely focused on utilizing this technology for economic development. So I think there's huge impact economically. I think we need to be thinking about investing in these AI technologies. And the way to really bring that on is to increase our skills development by having conversations and meetings like this where we can share the real world examples of what's happening in the industry today and talk about the risks, talk about our reservations, and talk about really how we move forward together collaboratively. All right, so job productivity enhancements. Like I said, there's a lot of repetitive and paper-based tasks that we can apply AI on, and we can really bring out those insights and drive more productivity. Again, Professor Eves talks about like a really important thing that we need to focus on is the quality of our data and the data that AI sits on top of, because data and information, which is one of the things that I stress in our UNESCO paper on policy, data and information is going to be worth more than oil and gas. So if we think about that as being a resource, having capability around understanding the data of your citizens, understanding how clean it is, making sure that you're going through and doing knowledge management on the data is only going to help AI when you're starting to deploy it. In industry, we say that, bad data in, bad data out. So if your information that AI systems are accessing aren't clean, aren't harmonized, you're not going to get the benefit from AI. All right, so integrating AI, we can look certainly, and we are seeing benefits of improved public service, better decision-making, better resource management, and really overall, I think this, if we position AI strategically in the Caribbean, we can certainly support economic growth in our economies and really see how we can use AI as a tool to support long-term growth and competitiveness. I certainly think that this is an opportunity that we should not shy away from. And one of the things that I've talked about in the paper is we can create some task force. We can come together, because I certainly think in the Caribbean, we need to be working as a group and not working individually as separate islands trying to implement AI. So it would be great if we could have some task force that are focused on various aspects of implementing AI, like for the government, implementing AI for healthcare and education. Coming together then to come up with an integrated strategy, I think would make it a lot easier and not so risky for the region. All right. I think we've talked about this before, but one thing I want to talk to you about chatbots is when I talk about the continuum of AI, the first generation of AI systems were what we call these chatbots. And this is something you can do today and not have any fear of moving forward with implementing chatbots that a citizen can go to your website, ask a question, how long does it take to get a driver's license or whatever, and have the chat bot come back with a question. That's just based on your standard processes that you have right now. And you enable that chat bot to be able to regurgitate whatever your standard processes are without a human being, without human intervention. So giving citizens the ability to activate on chatbots, to receive information about your current processes is something that I think is a very easy and low-hanging fruit project that you could do on any one of your processes. But where this is going for the future, and we're already into AI 2.0, I think I call it AI 2.0, is that these systems now are going to be called what the industry is calling agentic. And so this is going to be an AI system now that can not only just have an answer for us, what time does, how long does it take to potentially get my driver's license, but those systems are going to actually execute processes against that request. How long does it take to get my driver's license, and can I make an appointment for the earliest appointment at the driver's license depot? And so what we're seeing now is these systems not only answering questions, but actually activating on those questions and those answers and doing something about it. So we're in that 2.0 now, where it's not just about regurgitating information, it's actually getting those chatbots to actually take action. And that is the part that may be a little bit, maybe in the future for a lot of people to have that chatbot actually take action. But I think we are in the point right now where you can get chatbots to regurgitate information about your processes in an automated fashion online so citizens actually can get service and get access to information as quickly as possible. Phase 2 now is when we get the chatbot to go do something, either make an appointment or pay something on behalf of the citizen. And that's actually in the early stages of today and right now. So if there's any municipalities and governments out there that want to get into AI 2.0 and be an early adopter of that, that's currently being talked about and being implemented in industry right now. We see AI actually contributing to, transportation systems, smart waste management, and urban living enhancements. And we're seeing those case studies actually around the world. And as I said, if we think about AI as being a continuum, we can actually slice AI up into small chunks and apply them to small use cases. So think about dividing up your use cases and seeing how we can implement AI on those. And infrastructure planning, urban planning is something that we can use AI on. We're all concerned with fraud and fraud detection, and AI right now is actually really good at analyzing patterns, so they can indicate and identify potential irregularities in processes. They can help you with fraud detection and protect public resources by using AI. So these are use cases that are currently being implemented in industry today. Healthcare is another area that you can look at. And there's lots of advancements going on around the world around personalizing healthcare. One place that we could start is just maybe getting some information and educating yourself on what's happening out there, whether it is managing actually administratively all the paperwork that has to do in healthcare. It doesn't have to be about disease forecasting, but think about or like tailoring treatments to patients, but think about the whole administrative side of your healthcare industry, paperwork and all of that. AI, I think, will be a very wonderful addition to try to lessen some of the complexity that we have in our public healthcare processes. All right, more paperwork automating. All right, let's see, I have some more case studies here. So how do you get started? I think is one of the big things. As I said before, just understanding the benefits that AI can bring for certain processes. What are the advantages? What are the benefits in your operations? So thinking about various parts of your government, identifying those operational challenges and seeing how you can apply AI. Chatbots, as I talked about, are AI 1.0 technologies that you can think about placing on top of your websites to be able to have your customers access that. Start with these pilot projects, as I talked about. We don't have to go big, we can go small. So think about a process that you can use a chatbot on, right? And once you have tested that, then you can scale. And I think what's important here is actually picking a process that has high potential citizen visibility, because what we want is we want to have a good experience with our first implementations of AI, right? So if it takes, I don't know, hours to get something processed with government, maybe think about putting AI on that, lessening the time it takes for citizens to be able to interact with government so that they can get that good experience with AI. Because having a good experience is going to be 80% of the battle for adoption, right? If we have a bad experience, or if we don't put AI on a case study that's impactful, then we won't have the broad visibility and we won't have the good experience from the potential citizens. So make sure that you're picking a project that has high visibility and high upside in terms of the benefits. Start small, maybe with a chat bot environment to just answer questions or speed up the processing of paperwork. And we talked about clean data. So data is going to be important. And I actually think that in the Caribbean, we're going to have to create our own data sets. The broad-based data sets that are currently being used in the United States and by these large software companies will not do. And we will actually have to clean up our data and create actual custom data sets to be able to make sure that AI can understand our own context. Enrique, I see you have a question.
No, not necessarily a question, Ms. Simon. Just to give you a reminder every time, maybe we can wrap it up in 1 more minute and then we can go to the Q&A, please.
Lovely. All right, we're almost to the end. Okay. Transparency is going to be, as I talked about, important. Making sure that we have ethical AI practices. And the UNESCO policy paper for AI in the Caribbean gives wonderful areas for us to focus on to ensure that AI is ethically deployed. We actually need a lot of policies before we can implement AI properly to make sure that citizens are not harmed by these systems and we have recourse. And in the research on doing the paper, we don't have a lot of policies in the Caribbean to support the actual deployment and also the protection of citizens around AI. So we should get started on implementing and getting those up to speed. All right, moving quickly. I think we've talked about some of this. Data is going to be a challenge. In order to combat bias, we're going to have our own data sets. Remember, that's important, unique to our own context here in the Caribbean. There's gradual adoption. There's hybrid AI solutions. I think for me, the benefit here is just to get started. I don't think that we have to be cautious in any way. We can start with use cases that are not going to be as risky. But I think there's wonderful upside right now. There's lots of public and private partnerships as well. We talked about infrastructure. There's, Amazon, Microsoft in the region. They all have data and infrastructure stacks. We may need to have some collaboration and partnerships with the large infrastructure providers to make sure that we have our own space and own computing capability local to the region. And I think that is it. As I said, I think AI is a wonderful tool for revolutionizing citizen services, and I think we should go full speed ahead. We're actually not that far behind in terms of when we look globally on the implementing of AI. So I think it's a perfect opportunity right now to get started.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very practical on the case studies and recommendations until the very end. Ms. Simmons, thank you so much for that. Dear Karen, if we can share the screens to go with the Menti and we can have similar exchange to the one we have with Professor Reeves with Ms. Simmons. So this is some of the thoughts that our colleagues in the chat are saying about the Mentimeter. What is the biggest barrier to AI adoption in your country? Lack of technical expertise, data privacy and security concerns, limited funding and resources, but most people really have important resistance to change within the government. So I would leave the floor to you first, Ms. Simmons, and also, of course, Professor Reeves, if you want to pitch in on this. What do you think people are perceiving, of course, this resistance to change as a part of, I wouldn't say necessarily just AI uptaking, but digital uptaking overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is education. I think it is access to use cases like this. The actual organizational change is going to be the hardest, and we see that in private sector as well. So this is not any different. People in the government and people in private sector have the same concerns about AI, and there is going to be resistance. But I think we just have to keep talking, keep sharing information, holding hands together. This is why I think we shouldn't go separately, one island by one island. We need to form a block together and go into this change together. And what I can say is it's not going to stop. So I don't think that we can ignore AI at this moment. We just need to figure out how do we get smarter about what AI can do, and also the threats for AI and the opportunities. I'm incredibly bullish about using AI for economic development in the region, for enhancing citizen services. I've always thought that AI was going to be a game changer for us in the Caribbean. And I'm actually glad that maybe we've been a lagger in technology, whether that's because we can't afford it or whatever. I think we're at the right time now to start looking at these technologies. So resistance is going to happen, but we just need to continue to have discussions like this where we're raising actually our IQ around AI.
Thank you so much, Ms. Simmons. Dear Karen, can we move to the next Menti question? I think we have one last one, right? Yes. So what are some specific government services in your country that could benefit the most from AI-driven automatization or data analysis? And of course, again, the first one, social services and welfare programs, the streamline benefit applications, detect eligibility, fraud, and improve service delivery, followed by tax collection, and then for public healthcare services, which I think we can encompass social services and public as, I would say, one category overall. It's where the majority of our audience is thinking that AI could be used for. Ms. Simmons, and then again, Mr. Reeves, if you want to pitch in as well. What do you make out of this? We're seeing where the opportunity lies. You were reflecting on how bullish we need to be with uptaking AI. This is where our colleagues that are governmental public services are discussing or thinking where their mind drives and when they're discussing about AI. What are your thoughts on this, Ms. Simmons?
Yeah, I love this. I think I'm a social scientist, so I love everything about putting AI on social services so we can help people. And so I think that is a wonderful use case. I also think the tax collection services are also a great use case. In Jamaica, when I was there last, I had to spend almost 5 to 6 hours to go and renew my driver's license and get my car registered. So I just think about people in regions like that. Like, you know, we work by the day. So if you don't work during that day, you don't make money to eat. So how can we speed up those services? How can we make them more online so that I just have to spend a majority, like maybe an hour in the tax office, and I can get it done over my lunch hour? So I definitely think we need to be looking at applying AI to services that are going to speed up the time it takes to interact with government.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Simmons. And then just to have our Q&A as well in an order manner, because I'm seeing that infrastructure is quite the thematic from the questions that I've seen both in the chat and in the Q&A itself. So for both of you, Ms. Simmons and Mr. Eves, to have a kind of back and forth around this question, how can we build those capacities? And I think, of course, that is a specific conversation that we can have for our next meeting about infrastructure. But how can the Caribbean kind of leapfrog in terms of also bearing again in mind the limitations, because AI is a lot about energy consumption. At least that's the model we've been sold so far. There is a lot of investments that need to be made in data centers and whatnot. And I connect that to one of the questions in the chat saying, who is going to manage our data? Because again, these services are being provided from outside of the Caribbean to the Caribbean. And that is one, I think, challenge, not only for the Caribbean, this applies to Latin America as well. We're seeing it a lot, over $44 billion in tech services being sold and offshore from the US and Europe to Latin America, the Caribbean, then taken back home. So how do we shift or change that model? If you can provide us any ideas around those thoughts that we're seeing from our audience.
So I'll start, and Professor Eves jump in as well. I mean, I think that we don't need to worry about training data necessarily and having power usage here in the region. I think that we can collaborate with other parts of the world, perhaps the US, and collaborate on training our large language models that are unique to the United States, because it costs a lot of money to build data centers and infrastructure. And I think that we can create collaborations and partnerships in other parts of the world to train our data sets. However, I do believe that we need to have local capacity around keeping our data local and keeping it in the region. So, and I think we have to partner up on that. I certainly don't think that we can go one by one again. As a region, CARICOM region, we work with these big providers and we come up with agreements. We actually ask them to keep our data in our region. So that means we might have to have a small data center located here in the region so our data can stay here.
Thank you so much, Ms. Simmons. Mr. Reeves, maybe your thoughts on this and dwelling also on that cooperation component, because it seems to me, of course, given what you were saying in your presentation about this competition for resources, we are a very well-indebted region. So when we're discussing digitalization, we're discussing how do we move the investments from one area to the other, basically. And that's kind of the mindset that we see a lot in government. So how do we build that momentum? Maybe trying to connect those thoughts also from Ms. Simmons about the collaborative nature of taking AI in the Caribbean.
Yeah, maybe there's a few things I'd say. One is, there's a whole bunch of problems here that I don't think really need AI to be solved. Like, you don't need AI to be able to get a driver's license in an hour. There's lots of countries in the world that have solved this problem just with like good data governance. And so I remain kind of confused about why we would grab AI to go solve a whole bunch of problems that we don't really need it to solve. Particularly given that it may actually end up being a more expensive and complicated way of doing it. So personally, I'm like really interested in like what are specific use cases that would be helpful. And I remain fairly committed to the notion that you want to be using it to kind of burn down haystacks at the moment. I don't know many governments that are putting AI directly in front of citizens with no kind of path back to a human or kind of no remediation path. So I'd be really cautious about doing anything that looks like that. The second I'd say is you could partner with the United States. And I think now we're actually this very interesting question about like, what are the geopolitical risks of doing that? This current administration has been quite comfortable using all sorts of economic tools at its disposal to bend the will of other governments towards policy that it likes. So if your ability to offer services as a government is dependent on your access to data models and AI systems that are housed in the United States, you have to begin to ask yourself, well, what is the threat that those could be cut off if you're not willing to comply with the interests of that country? So I would probably want to have, at the moment, either a localized strategy where you think like, are the AIs we need to use really need to be cutting edge, or could they be kind of cheaper? Like, can we satisfy them with cheaper local versions? And I may want to have a more geopolitically diversified approach to my AI strategy so that I'm not reliant on a single actor or a single player.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Reeves, because I think it connects also what Ms. Simmons was saying about building locally and building up on, I would say, in a smart, efficient way. And I think that's the call to action for Latin America and the Caribbean as well. Both the regions that are neighbors need to connect better, to discuss better, and maybe to make smart investments in systems in the way you were showing us through DPI, which is something that UNDP, UNESCO, and all of our allies in this meeting are also pushing for governments to build these capacities in a way that it's more independent to an extent that allows them to play over their own interests and necessities, of course. I'm going to go through one of the last questions before I go to several announcements to close up this meeting. So I want to connect this thought because I've been seeing a lot about conversations regarding data usage. And one of our participants is asking, some of the countries in the Caribbean are still in the process of establishing cybersecurity emergency response teams. And we know that cybersecurity is a major, we're discussing e-governance and data analytics. So how can the governments in the Caribbean that are still catching up to concepts such as cybersecurity and being able to preemptively have teams that are allocated for those needs, being able to, again, leapfrog towards what is needed to embrace AI transformations, or I would say broadly, not only AI, but of course also DPI. Professor Reeves, Ms. Simmons, your thoughts on that?
I think the first thing I have to say about the Caribbean is I do feel like the potential for collaboration across the Caribbean countries is such a massive opportunity that I know gets touched on and happens at times, but I feel it gets undercapitalized. Like it is such a huge opportunity that continues to be missed, and that the Caribbean countries are, I mean, just the social capital is very finite, and to be able to kind of replicate all of the capacities of a major nation state within each individual country strikes me as very daunting. And so there's this huge opportunity to pool resources and pool capital to try to come up with joint solutions. And I don't know what more to say then, but that's not really an AI or a DPI conversation. That's a much broader kind of Caribbean political conversation, but I don't think it's ever been more urgent than it is now.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And just to go back to your question, I think a really just from a supplier perspective, because I'm coming from actual, what's happening in industry now, I would just try to find a supplier that has a really strong cybersecurity presence also built into whatever solution they have, because it's a separate thing, but it's also in the platform of whatever solution, so that you don't have to have like a whole separate cybersecurity solution separate from your AI. It should actually be integrated into one. But just going back to the bigger perspective again, certainly I have always advocated for collaboration and collective action together as a block. I think we have a lot more power in the Caribbean than we realize, and we can go together and negotiate with a lot of these big players, whether that's the US, China, wherever you want to negotiate. We need to negotiate as a block together and go together. And I think it's an important point that cannot be understated at this point. In order to go fast and to actually have 360 knowledge on AI and the benefits and potential risks and what we need to do, we actually need to collaborate together. And that's always been my number one recommendation going forward.
And I think we can kind of wrap up, because we have 5 minutes left, the conversation on that high spirit about cooperation. And that's the reason why, again, UNDP, UNESCO, the Association of Caribbean States, the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, IDB CAF, we have come together to generate this first space, of course, to discuss some ideas, to build some capacities at Caribbean level, but also with the aim of maybe foster conversation and exchanges amongst our participants that are working for the public sector in the Caribbean, because you actually have the capacities to navigate these new challenges that the region is facing with optimism, of course, with a bit of realism as well. And I love that back and forth between both of our panelists today, kind of shape-shifting between what the dreams are, what's possible now, what should be possible as well. So I thank both Professor Reeves and Ms. Simmons for sharing all those visions with us today. I think it's been a quite engaging discussion with our participants as well. And I wanted to go to a couple of things before closing or adjourning this meeting today. The first is that we'll be sharing a link now. If you can give us some feedback about this meeting, it will allow us to improve or to build on the next one as well. Or my colleague Karen has just shared a link on the chat. And about the networking, of course, we will be sharing an email to all the participants, and maybe this is an idea for future meetings that we can have some informal spaces, reminding everyone that this first session is just the first out of 4 that we're aiming to have this year, and that this comes back from an in-person conference we hosted in Trinidad and Tobago last year, the SITS 2.0 forum. So if all the participants that are still with us in the chat can click on the link and give us some feedback on the meeting, that would be great. And while you do that, I'll be sharing my screen just for a minute to be sharing some resources about AI that UNDP has been developing over the past months. So if everybody's seeing my screen right now, you can also just scan this QR code. This first knowledge resource comes from our Singapore Service Center in collaboration with the Rwanda government at the Summit of the Future 2024. We put together this AI playbook for small states. This is, of course, concerning all of the Caribbean as well. And this is a collection of good practices, building blocks, AI development and using government and industry, trusted ecosystems with AI governance, global partnerships and cooperation. And this is a living document. We're actually aiming that some of the content that is coming out of these meetings, some of the questions, some of the reflection, of course, of our experts can also be fed into the AI playbook. This will also be shared over email, but if you want to, of course, scan with your the QR with your phones, you can get access to the book, to the playbook right away, but this will be also shared over email. And a second opportunity that we wanted to share with all of our participants here is the ITU Academy that is being co-hosted, as you can see, by the Global Gateway Initiative with the European Union, I2, and UNDP, which is Inclusive Digital Transformation in Small Island Development States. This is an online instructor-led course that is certified by I2 for government officials and policymakers. This will also be shared by email as well, but if you want to take some time and scan the QR code, you can register straight away. So without further ado, and I think I also want to congratulate ourselves for being so punctual, both at the beginning and at the end. It's almost exact timing, 1 minute that we have for this. Thank you again, our panelists today, Professor Eves and Ms. Simmons, for being with us today. We will be sharing, as we had announced before, some key reflections from this meeting in a written manner in a website and in a link over email to all the participants that registers to today's meeting. And if you have any extra questions on any other pieces of knowledge that you want to share, feel free to reach out to us over email. It's been a pleasure to be your host today. Thank you so much again to everyone for being here. Hope you have an amazing day wherever you are joining to us in the Caribbean or all around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. I'll drop.
Thank you so much, Professor Reeves.